I came to art dealing a bit late. My starting point in life was in investment banking, and then I ultimately, after business school, went back to school to do a postgraduate degree at the Courtauld, and that was actually European art history, not Asian. Shortly afterwards, I joined Jacob Rothschild, Lord Rothschild, who had bought Colnaghi, which was then the great old master painting establishment in England. And then gradually my interest gravitated towards China, and has really become my passion, Chinese culture, ever since. Went on dealing in mostly Chinese material, and I was in China going back and forth over the 80s, and just to get to know the country. And I wasn't really meeting artists then. My interest was much more in China in general. When I was meeting artists in the 90s, it was such a pleasure because the artists were quite modest in the way they lived. My motivation for dealing in both Chinese antiquities and in Chinese modern and contemporary art is that the antiquities feed my interest in ancient culture, and my interest in contemporary work feeds my interest in what's happening in China today. I'm fascinated in the last 20 years, more than 20 years, the vitality, imagination, creativity in contemporary China. Across the board, it's happening in film, in poetry, in design, in art, of course, even in certain areas of philosophy. It's such a pleasure for me to to witness. And because they're connected, whatever happens in China today is deeply connected with what happened in the past. It's the fundamental respect that you have for the longest continuous culture in human history. And it's very interesting that in China, out of 1.4 billion people, there's only a handful of artists working in ink on paper who have attracted an international audience. And these ink painters are fascinating for me, and I think are delivering a terrific message, which is that via their knowledge of and study of the old masters in China, they've been able to create a new pictorial language. It's very similar to what was happening in the 20th century in Europe, where you had Cézanne and Picasso and Braque and Kandinsky creating their revolutionary language. But how? By absorbing the lessons from people like Velázquez and Raphael and Michelangelo and Leonardo and Poussin, by looking back and absorbing and studying the old man, Delacroix, all this. And it's only through that knowledge, that, how would you call it, almost scholastic knowledge, that intellectual understanding as well as visual. Then there are people like Liu Dan, who is probably the greatest of all the Chinese ink painters of a traditional bent, a traditional leaning, who again, in works that look very, first glance, very traditional, ink painting, grey, black ink painting on white, and are flowers or trees or rocks, etc. These works are very revolutionary because they're very different, but in very subtle ways. And then an artist like Zhou Deshu, who is very, very radically different to anything that has been seen before, but it is ink on canvas, and it's just a very different, new, revolutionary work, which actually does have a lot of appeal to younger people. And I felt that was interesting for the Chinese world today, the young people in China, who by looking at good contemporary ink painting, they would be connected directly with Chinese reverence and respect for the past, which is incorporated into these paintings. But at the same time, these paintings are very different and are creating a totally new pictorial language. You know, we were the first dealer in the Western world to produce many publications on all sorts of art, but we were the first dealer in the Western world to produce a major exhibition on Chinese contemporary art. And we did that in 2001 in Sotheby's had given me 20,000 square feet at the top of the building in York Avenue in New York. And that exhibition was an enormous success. And we had 2,800 people at the opening and an enormous amount of interest. So how do I mold my message? It was then through catalogs, publications, text, and then talking my head off. So it is trying to deliver a message, the message I've just described to you about Chinese contemporary culture, which I think is a fire, is a light. And it is really interesting from every point of view. And in order to understand the mindset, the contemporary mindset in China, which is going to have to be understood by people outside China for the rest of history, if you want to, keep an eye on that space, because nothing is going to stop China continuing to emerge as a major force on this planet. And it's quite interesting that there's no great empire has ever come back onto the world stage. Mesopotamia never came back. Greece never came back. Egypt never came back. And yet China has. Their past civilization is back and has to be taken seriously.